The air in the kitchen turned rancid that night, thick with the sour reek of betrayal, when Mom dropped her twisted ultimatum, her voice slicing through the drone of the ancient fridge like a rusty blade through my chest. I was 24, clawing my way through life with a diner job, the grease-stained apron my badge of independence since Dad's death left us in this decaying house. I'd stumbled in after a double shift, feet aching, expecting her usual nag about rent or my laziness, not the nightmare she'd been brewing. She sat at the chip table, hands clasped tight, her eyes burning with a feverish glint I'd never seen, and let it fall like a guillotine. "You need to marry Victor," she said, her tone cold, unyielding, like she was telling me to mop the floor, not shredding my entire existence. Victor, my stepbrother, the gaunt, hollow-eyed creep who'd slunk into our world when she remarried years back, a guy whose stares lingered too long, whose bony fingers brushed mine too often at dinner, leaving a chill I couldn't shake. I choked on my water, a bitter laugh clawing up my throat, thinking it was some warped jest, but her face stayed granite, her jaw set. "And have his kid," she pressed, leaning in, her breath hot with a zeal that made my skin crawl. "It's the only way to keep the family together." My stomach flipped, a nauseous wave of disgust and dread crashing over me, as I gaped at this woman who'd raised me, now a stranger spinning a horror I couldn't unhear. I shoved the chair back, its screech on the linoleum a howl of protest, my voice trembling but razor-sharp. "You've lost it, Mom. He's my stepbrother. That's sick. It's never happening." She didn't twitch, just crossed her arms, lips thinning into that stubborn line I dreaded since I was a kid, the one that meant she'd dig her heels in until I broke. "It's not about what you want," she snapped, her words a lash across my face. "It's about legacy. Your dad's money, the house, it's all locked up unless you do this. The inheritance, Dad's life savings, the one anchor he'd left me to escape this suffocating trap, now dangled like bait in her deranged game. I'd clung to that promise, a lifeline to break free from her rules, this rotting shell of a home, the ghost of Dad fading under her new husband's shadow. But she twisted it into a weapon. A lie I couldn't disprove yet. Victor slouched in from the hall, his greasy hair catching the flickering bulb, a smirk curling his thin lips like he'd been eavesdropping, waiting for his moment. "We'd be good together," he muttered, voice low and slick, dripping with a confidence that made my gut churn, my throat burn with bile. I bolted upright, the room spinning, their voices a swarm of wasps as I fled to my room, slamming the door so hard the frame shook, my heart hammering like it'd shatter my ribs. Sleep was a cruel mirage that night, my mind a relentless loop of her words, his leer, the grotesque weight of her demand crushing me like a coffin lid. I sat on my sagging bed, knees pulled tight, the moonlight slashing through the blinds, casting prison bars across the peeling wallpaper. Mom had always been a control freak, her grip iron after Dad passed, her marriage to Victor's dad a chain she'd locked around us, but this was a dive into lunacy I couldn't fathom. Victor was a phantom, a guy who'd hover in doorways, his eyes tracing my every move when he thought I wasn't looking. His presence a violation I'd chalked up to awkwardness until now. It snapped into focus, a sickening clarity, his patience a predator's slow stalk I'd been too blind to catch. And the inheritance? Dad had pulled me aside before he died, his voice rough with chemo but firm, swearing that money, that house, was mine, a safety net she couldn't touch. But now she was spinning it into a snare, a fabrication I'd have to dismantle. I rocked back, fists balled, the walls of my cramped room pressing in, their plan a noose tightening around my neck. I'd spent years dodging her control, scraping by to keep my head above water, and now this, a demand to bind myself to that creep, to bear his child, a legacy I'd rather burn than claim. But beneath the terror, a fire flared, not just panic, but a searing, defiant rage. She thought she could force this, mold me into her warped vision, tie me to Victor's slimy grasp, but I'd fight, rip through this madness with every ounce of strength I had. They'd misjudged me, banked on me bending, and that was their first, fatal misstep. The days after Mom's insane demand turned my world into a battlefield, her obsession seeping into every corner of my life, like a toxic spill I couldn't contain. I'd barely slept, her words and Victor's smirk haunting me, but I dragged myself to the diner the next morning, needing the clatter of plates and the hum of strangers to drown out the chaos at home. I was mid-shift, juggling trays, the smell of burnt coffee and bacon grease a shaky anchor, when she showed up, striding through the door like she owned the place. Her hair was wild, her eyes sharp, and she planted herself at the counter, ignoring the stares from my coworkers. "We need to talk," she barked, loud enough to turn heads, her voice a whip cracking over the chatter. I froze, a tray trembling in my hands, my stomach sinking as she leaned in, oblivious to the scene she was making. "You can't run from this. It's your duty," she said, her tone a mix of plea and threat, and I felt the walls of my sanctuary crumble, her madness chasing me even here. I tried to brush her off, hissing under my breath, "Not here, Mom, I'm working," but she didn't budge, her fingers drumming the counter, her gaze boring into me like I was a disobedient kid. "Victor's waiting," she pressed, dropping his name like a grenade, and I flinched, the memory of his oily voice flooding back, twisting my insides. Customers gawked, my boss shot me a look, and I wanted to vanish, to sink through the sticky floor and escape the humiliation she was piling on. She kept going, her voice rising. "Your dad would have wanted this, the family whole, the money secure." Weaving lies about the inheritance into her rant, each word a fresh cut. I'd heard Dad's promise with my own ears, his weak hand gripping mine as he swore it was mine. No strings, no conditions. But she was rewriting it, spinning a tale where I had to marry that creep to claim what was rightfully mine. I snapped, slamming the tray down. "Get out, you're lying," my voice raw, shaking, but she just smirked, like she'd won a round, and left, leaving me to face the whispers and pitying glances alone. Work became a gauntlet after that. Her visits, a relentless siege I couldn't dodge. She'd show up unannounced, sometimes with Victor in tow, his lanky frame slouching by the door, his eyes raking over me while she preached her gospel of family unity. My coworkers started muttering, my boss pulled me aside, his patience thinning, "Handle your drama, kid, or you're out." I'd nod, swallowing the panic, but inside I was screaming. The diner no longer a refuge, but a stage for her harassment. She'd call too, her voice crackling through the line during breaks. "You're selfish. Think of Victor. Think of the baby." Each call a hammer to my resolve, her lies about Dad's will twisting tighter. I'd hang up, hands shaking, the weight of her words pressing down, but I clung to the truth. Dad's voice in my head, a lifeline against her fiction. Victor texted once. "We're meant to be," and I blocked him, bile rising, his creepiness a shadow I couldn't shake. I started documenting it. Every visit, every call, scribbling notes in a beat-up journal, a shield against her gaslighting. She'd claim I'd misunderstood Dad, that the inheritance was conditional, her lies piling up like trash, but I knew better. His promise etched in my bones. I'd lie awake in my room, the house quiet but tense, her footsteps pacing downstairs, plotting, and I'd clutch that journal. My proof, my fight. She thought she could wear me down, force me into Victor's arms, into a life I'd rather die than live. But I was steeling myself, building a wall against her madness. The diner was my battleground now, her harassment a war I hadn't signed up for, but I'd push back, find a way to unravel her lies, and keep what was mine. They'd underestimated my spine, and I'd make them regret it, step by brutal step. The harassment at the diner had become a suffocating siege, Mom's relentless intrusions and Victor's lurking presence, turning my shifts into a grueling test of endurance. But it was her lies about the inheritance that finally shoved me to the brink, igniting a desperate need to unearth the truth before her insanity consumed me. I was hanging on to my job by a fraying thread, each day a battle against her disruptions, her voice booming over the clatter of plates as she stormed in, wild-eyed and unyielding. "You're throwing away everything your dad wanted," she'd shout, slamming her purse on the counter, ignoring the customers craning their necks, her obsession a public spectacle I couldn't escape. "The money's tied up until you marry Victor," she'd insist, her words a venomous chant, twisting Dad's legacy into a shackle she dangled over me. I'd fire back, voice raw and ragged. "That's a lie, stop it." But she'd just lean closer, her breath hot with defiance, Victor hovering by the door, his greasy smirk a silent taunt. My boss's glare sharpened, my coworkers' whispers grew into a buzz, and I felt the ground slipping, her madness strangling the last shred of peace I'd carved out, pushing me to fight or break. I couldn't trust her version anymore, not with Dad's promise ringing in my ears, a vow I had to prove before she buried it in her delusions. After a shift, I'd collapse in my room, the house quiet but tense, and dig through old boxes, my hands shaking as I hunted for the will she'd always dodged talking about. She'd claimed it was lost after Dad passed, her excuses flimsy, but I remembered him mentioning a lawyer, a gruff old guy named Hal who'd sorted his affairs. I flipped through a dusty phone book, heart pounding, until I found his number, dialing with fingers slick with sweat. "Yeah, I've still got it," Hal rasped when he answered, his voice a lifeline cutting through the dark, agreeing to meet me at his cramped office across town. I slipped out that night, Mom snoring downstairs, Victor's heavy breathing a faint menace through the walls, and drove through the shadows, the weight of her lies propelling me forward. Hal slid the will across his desk, yellowed but crisp, Dad's signature a bold slash at the bottom, and there it was. The house, the money, all mine. No strings, no mention of Victor or marriage, just a clear bequeathal to me, his daughter. I gripped it, tears stinging, a flood of relief and fury crashing through me as her fiction shattered, piece by brittle piece. I stormed home with the will burning a hole in my bag, confronting her the next morning in the kitchen where she sat sipping coffee. Victor slouched nearby like a hyena sniffing for scraps. "Explain this," I said, voice a low growl, slamming the papers on the table, the sound a gunshot in the tense air. She froze, her mug trembling, eyes darting over the text as the truth glared back. Undeniable. "That's fake," she sputtered, her voice cracking, but the panic in her eyes sold her out, and I pressed harder. "It's Dad's will. Hal had it. You've been lying this whole time." Victor shifted, his smirk fading, unease creeping into his bony frame, and she floundered. "It's for the family. You don't get it," her excuses unraveling like cheap thread. I didn't relent, my anger a shield. "You made it up to chain me to him, but it's done." She lunged for the papers, fingers clawing, but I yanked them back, heart racing. The power tilting as her lie collapsed under Dad's own hand, a testament she couldn't rewrite. I didn't stop there, taking the will to a lawyer of my own, a no-nonsense woman named Tara, who pored over it in her sleek office, her verdict swift. "It's rock solid," she said, stacking the pages, her voice crisp with certainty. "She's got no claim, and he's got less." I exhaled, the floor steadying beneath me, a lifeline I could cling to. But Mom's harassment didn't falter, her diner visits doubling, her lies morphing into desperate wails. "You're destroying us," with Victor's shadow ever present, his eyes still crawling over me. I stood taller now, the will my armor, her words bouncing off as I held the truth in my hands. She'd built this scheme on quicksand, banking on my ignorance, hoping I'd cave to her pressure and Victor's creepiness, but I'd ripped it apart, exposed her as the manipulator she'd morphed into. Work remained a war zone, her presence a plague I couldn't shake, but I had evidence now, a path to freedom, and I'd wield it to end this nightmare she'd forced on me. They'd underestimated my resolve, thought I'd fold under their weight, but I was rising, and I'd make them choke on every lie they'd dared to spin. With the will in my hands and Tara's legal muscle behind me, I was done bending to Mom's madness, ready to draw a line she couldn't cross. But she turned the heat up, her harassment a wildfire I had to stamp out. The diner was my last shred of sanity, the clink of dishes and hiss of the grill a fragile shield. But she kept storming in, her voice a battering ram, shredding my peace. She'd perch at the counter, Victor slinking in behind her, his bony frame a shadow I couldn't shake, and she'd launch into her tirade. "You're spitting on your dad's grave, denying Victor, denying the family." Her lies about the inheritance twisted tighter, her eyes blazing with a desperation that made my skin prickle, and I'd snap back. "I've got the will, it's mine. Stop this." My voice a raw edge cutting through her noise. Customers stared, my boss's patience frayed to snapping, and I felt the job slipping. Her obsession a noose tightening around my neck, but I wasn't backing down, not now, not ever. I warned her once, after a shift when she cornered me by the dumpster, Victor lurking nearby, his smirk a taunt I wanted to wipe off with my fist. "Leave me alone," I said, voice low, steady, "or I'll get a restraining order." She laughed, a sharp brittle sound. "You wouldn't dare." But I saw the flicker of doubt, and Victor shifted, uneasy, his confidence cracking. Tara had prepped me, her words crisp. "Document everything, we've got grounds." And I did, my journal swelling with dates, times, every venomous word she spat. She came back the next day, louder. "You'll regret this, the money's ours," and I called security, my hands shaking as they escorted her out. Victor trailing, his glare a promise of trouble. My boss pulled me aside after. "One more stunt like that, you're gone." And I nodded, swallowing the panic, knowing I had to end this before she torched my last lifeline. I filed the restraining order that week, Tara guiding me through the courthouse, the will and my notes a fortress of proof. The judge didn't flinch, her gavel a sharp crack as she granted it. Mom barred from the diner, from me, a 50-yard wall she couldn't breach. I exhaled, the air lighter, but the victory was bitter, her absence a void that echoed with years of her control. She didn't stop entirely, switching to calls from blocked numbers, her voice a hiss through the line. "Victor deserves you, the inheritance is tied to him." Lies I'd disproven but she clung to, desperate. I'd hang up, block each one, the will taped to my mirror, Dad's words a shield against her venom. Victor tried once, slipping a note under my door, "We're family, don't do this." His scrawl a creep's plea, and I burned it, the ashes a small triumph over his slimy grasp. Work steadied, the diner quiet without her chaos, but the fight wasn't over, her shadow lingering in every corner of my life. I moved out, a cheap studio across town, my few boxes a declaration of freedom, the house a memory I'd leave behind. Tara pushed the inheritance claim, papers filed to secure it, Mom's lies unraveling in court as Hal's copy held firm. She'd call, voice muffled through the order's limits, "You're tearing us apart," but I'd let it ring, her guilt trips falling flat. I stood taller, the restraining order a sword, the will my crown, and though she'd nearly cost me everything, I'd held my ground. They banked on breaking me, forcing me into Victor's arms, into a life I'd rather die than live, but I'd fought back, carved a path through their madness. The war wasn't won, not yet, but I'd taken a stand, and they'd feel the weight of my defiance, every step a brick in the wall I'd built against them. With the will in my hands and Tara's legal muscle behind me, I was done bending to Mom's madness, ready to draw a line she couldn't cross, but she turned the heat up. Her harassment a wildfire I had to stamp out. The diner was my last shred of sanity, the clink of dishes and hiss of the grill a fragile shield, but she kept storming in, her voice a battering ram, shredding my peace. She'd perch at the counter, Victor slinking in behind her, his bony frame a shadow I couldn't shake, and she'd launch into her tirade, "You're spitting on your dad's grave," denying Victor, denying the family. Her lies about the inheritance twisted tighter, her eyes blazing with a desperation that made my skin prickle, and I'd snap back, "I've got the will, it's mine, stop this." My voice a raw edge cutting through her noise. Customers stared, my boss's patience frayed to snapping, and I felt the job slipping. Her obsession a noose tightening around my neck, but I wasn't backing down, not now, not ever. I warned her once, after a shift when she cornered me by the dumpster, Victor lurking nearby, his smirk a taunt I wanted to wipe off with my fist. "Leave me alone," I said, voice low, steady, "or I'll get a restraining order." She laughed, a sharp brittle sound. "You wouldn't dare." But I saw the flicker of doubt, and Victor shifted, uneasy, his confidence cracking. Tara had prepped me, her words crisp. "Document everything, we've got grounds." And I did, my journal swelling with dates, times, every venomous word she spat. She came back the next day, louder. "You'll regret this, the money's ours." And I called security, my hands shaking as they escorted her out, Victor trailing, his glare a promise of trouble. My boss pulled me aside after. "One more stunt like that, you're gone." And I nodded, swallowing the panic, knowing I had to end this before she torched my last lifeline. I filed the restraining order that week, Tara guiding me through the courthouse, the will and my notes a fortress of proof. The judge didn't flinch, her gavel a sharp crack as she granted it. Mom barred from the diner, from me, a 50-yard wall she couldn't breach. I exhaled, the air lighter, but the victory was bitter. Her absence a void that echoed with years of her control. She didn't stop entirely, switching to calls from blocked numbers, her voice a hiss through the line. "Victor deserves you, the inheritance is tied to him." Lies I'd disproven but she clung to. Desperate. I'd hang up, block each one, the will taped to my mirror, Dad's words a shield against her venom. Victor tried once, slipping a note under my door, "We're family, don't do this." His scrawl a creep's plea, and I burned it, the ashes a small triumph over his slimy grasp. Work steadied, the diner quiet without her chaos, but the fight wasn't over. Her shadow lingering in every corner of my life. I moved out, a cheap studio across town, my few boxes a declaration of freedom, the house a memory I'd leave behind. Tara pushed the inheritance claim, papers filed to secure it, Mom's lies unraveling in court as Hal's copy held firm. She'd call, voice muffled through the order's limits, "You're tearing us apart," but I'd let it ring, her guilt trips falling flat. I stood taller, the restraining order a sword, the will my crown, and though she'd nearly cost me everything, I'd held my ground. They banked on breaking me, forcing me into Victor's arms, into a life I'd rather die than live. But I'd fought back, carved a path through their madness. The war wasn't won, not yet, but I'd taken a stand, and they'd feel the weight of my defiance. Every step a brick in the wall I'd built against them. With Dad's will in my grip and Tara's legal steel backing me, I was through bowing to Mom's deranged crusade, ready to plant my flag and dare her to cross it. But she turned her harassment into a full-blown inferno, scorching every inch of my life I'd fought to hold. The diner was my last bastion. The clatter of plates and sizzle of grease a shaky refuge, but she kept charging in, her voice a thunderclap over the hum of the crowd, shredding my fragile peace. She'd claim the counter like a throne, Victor trailing behind, his lanky frame a shadow I couldn't outrun, and she'd unleash her sermon, "You're betraying your dad, denying Victor, destroying our family." Her lies about the inheritance tightened like a vice, her eyes wild with a desperation that set my nerves on edge, and I'd fire back, "I've got the will, it's mine, stop this nonsense." My voice a jagged blade slicing through her rant. Customers gawked, forks paused mid-bite, my boss's glare a warning shot across my bow. and I felt my job teetering. Her obsession a strangling vine I had to hack away, but I wasn't folding. Not now. Not after coming this far. I gave her one chance to back off, cornered after a shift by the dumpster, the air thick with grease and tension, Victor lurking nearby, his smirk a taunt I ached to smash. "Leave me alone," I said, voice low, steady as steel, "or I'll get a restraining order, I mean it." She laughed, a sharp, brittle bark. "You wouldn't dare, you're too weak." But I saw the flicker of uncertainty, and Victor shifted, his confidence wavering, his bony hands twitching. Tara had drilled me, her advice crisp, "Log every move, we've got a case," and I'd been meticulous, my journal a growing arsenal of dates, times, every venomous word she flung. She stormed the diner again the next day, louder, unhinged. "You'll regret this, the money's ours, Victor's entitled," and I snapped, calling security, my pulse hammering as they hauled her out, Victor slinking after, his glare a promise of revenge. My boss cornered me after, voice tight, "One more mess like that, you're done." And I nodded, swallowing the dread, knowing I had to crush this before she burned my last lifeline to ash. I filed the restraining order that week, Tara leading me through the courthouse, the will and my notes a fortress of evidence stacked high. The judge's eyes narrowed as she read, her gavel a sharp crack sealing Mom's ban from the diner, for me, a 50-yard barrier she couldn't breach. I walked out, the air lighter, my chest loosening, but the wind tasted bitter, her absence a hollow echo of the years she'd ruled me. She didn't quit, pivoting to calls from blocked numbers, her voice a hiss through the static. "Victor deserves you, the inheritance is tied to him, you're selfish." Lies I'd dismantled but she clung to, frantic. I'd slam the phone down, block each one, the will taped to my mirror, Dad's signature a shield against her poison. Victor tried his luck, slipping a note under my door. "We're family, don't ruin this." His scrawl a creep's desperate grab, and I burned it, the flames licking the paper a small, fierce victory over his slimy reach. I couldn't stay in that house anymore, her presence a ghost haunting every creak, so I moved, a cramped studio across town, my few belongings packed in haste, a declaration of freedom from her grip. Tara pushed the inheritance claim forward, filing papers to lock it down. Mom's fabrications crumbling in court as Hal's copy stood unassailable. She calls still, her voice muffled through the order's limits. "You're tearing us apart, you'll pay." But I'd let it ring. Her guilt trips falling on deaf ears, my resolve a wall she couldn't crack. Work steadied, the diner quiet without her chaos, my boss easing off as the drama faded, but the fight wasn't over. Her shadow a stain I couldn't scrub clean. I stood taller, the restraining order my sword, the will my crown, and though she'd nearly cost me my job, my sanity, I'd held my ground, carved a jagged path through their insanity. They banked on crushing me, forcing me into Victor's clammy embrace, into a life I'd rather die than endure. But I'd fought back, built a fortress from their ruins. The war wasn't finished, not yet, but I'd taken my stand, and they'd feel the full force of my defiance. Every step a brick in the barrier I'd raised against their twisted dream. The restraining order and the will gave me a foothold, but Mom's relentless obsession and Victor's creeping shadow kept the war raging, pushing me to sever the last threads of their hold and claim my life for good. I'd moved to the studio, the diner job hanging on by a whisper, and though her physical assaults had stopped, her calls persisted, a barrage of blocked numbers lighting up my phone with venomous pleas. "You're killing us, Victor needs you. The money's for the family." She'd wail, her voice a claw through the line, lies I'd crushed but she resurrected, desperate to drag me back. I'd let it ring, my finger hovering over block, the will on my wall, a silent vow from Dad that I wouldn't bend. Victor upped the ante, loitering near my new place, his lanky figure caught in the streetlight's glow, eyes glinting as he watched my window, a predator circling I couldn't ignore. I'd lock the door, heart pounding, his notes ashes still bitter in my memory, and knew this wasn't over until I cut them out completely. Tara pushed the inheritance battle to its end, her office a war room as we filed the final claim, the will's clarity a battering ram against Mom's delusions. The court date loomed, and I walked in, spine straight, Tara at my side, facing Mom across the room, her face a mask of defiance. Victor slouched beside her, his smirk a fading echo. The judge sliced through her protests, her claims of family rights and Dad's intent crumbling under Hal's pristine copy. Every word Dad wrote a nail in her coffin. The estate is hers. The judge ruled, gavel sharp, and I exhaled. The money, the house mine, no strings, no Victor, just as Dad promised. Mom's eyes blazed, her mouth opening to argue, but the bailiff moved and she shrank, defeated, Victor's hand on her arm a weak tether as they shuffled out. I stood there, the weight lifting, a victory carved from years of her control, but the fight had scarred me, and I wasn't done yet. I sold the house, that rotting shell of memories and madness, the cache of fresh start I'd guard with my life. Mom called one last time, her voice a broken rasp. "You've ruined everything, how could you?" But I cut her off. "You did this, not me." And hung up, the line dead, her power gone. Victor vanished after that, his creepy watch post empty, the restraining order a specter keeping him at bay. I quit the diner, the grease and chaos a chapter I closed, taking a clerk job at a hardware store, quiet, steady, a place to breathe. My studio became a sanctuary, bare but mine, the will framed above my bed, Dad's promise a beacon through the dark. I'd wake to silence, no screams, no leers, just my own rhythm. And though the hate lingered, a dull ache for the mother I'd lost to this insanity, it fueled me. A fire I'd turned to my own purpose. Life leveled out, not perfect but mine, each day a brick in a wall I'd built against their nightmare. I'd walk home from work, the air cool, the streets empty of their shadows, and feel a jagged peace, a hard-won freedom from the woman who'd tried to chain me to Victor, to a child I'd never bear. Tara checked in, her voice warm. "You're clear, they've got nothing." And I nodded, the legal ties severed, the inheritance mine to wield. Mom's face haunted me sometimes, her manic eyes, Victor's slimy grin, but I'd push them back, lock them in a box I'd never reopen. They'd underestimated me, thought they could force me into their twisted vision, rob me of Dad's gift with lies and guilt, but I'd broken free, torn their plan to shreds. The war was over, the final break mine to claim, and I stood taller, scars and all, a survivor of their madness, with a life I'd forged alone, unyielding, and wholly my own.